Oh god. Ah. Whatever. Oh my god, that scared me. Alright, that's my intro. Gonna have to ask for some forgiveness on this McFarlane Toy review because I really loved the look of this figure and that's why I pre-ordered. Unfortunately, I really don't know much about future state Batman, at least within the context of the comics, because during my little research prior to recording this, I knew that he takes place in the future state line, in fact in the same kind of environment and timeline as the Dark Detective Batman that I've covered before, but I understand that this is a different iteration of Batman. David here from the future. Sorry, I have to do a quick interruption here. I did a little bit of extra research during the editing process and I figured out that it was actually Luke Fox who plays Batman in the future state timeline here. So my bad that I didn't really properly look. So for those of you who are posting in the comments, I appreciate you in advance. Anyways, let's get back to the video. But I will be covering it from a action figure perspective, the McFarlane Toys DC Multiverse Future State Next Batman, because frankly, as superficial as it might sound, I thought he looked badass. I actually really dig this look of the Batman suit, or at least the Batman motif, considering the sources, like I said, that I've kind of read up on. But I just really vibe with the actual look of the bat suit here. I like the padding, the extra kind of clash of the colors with this kind of muted blue, silver blue, I don't know what it is, but I just love the pleasing look of this color scheme with the black, gray, and like I said, this kind of muted blue. It's often the color gradient background that I often use in an awful lot of my thumbnails. So because of that, I was like, I really gravitated towards the look of this particular figure. And for a change of pace, I like that he doesn't have a mouthpiece. I like that he has a guard up inside of that particular section of the cowl, and because of that, it always makes sense to me. I'm like, protect the mouth, you know, like bad guys could always shoot in that direction and ultimately kill you, you know, with the rightly angled bullet that could always take out Batman. And I always thought, a lot of people always thought, you know, why don't they always aim for the face? So it's good to see that this particular Batman thought ahead. Aside from that though, in terms of the actual look of this particular Batman, the cowl is properly molded and sculpted beautifully with the white eyes and, like I said, the covered up mouth. I really love this cowl. Looking down upon the neck, I noticed that he's even got a similar motif. This might have just been a happy accident, but if you look closely amongst the collar, you'll notice that he's got a color very reminiscent of that of Robert Pattinson's The Batman. He's got that collar that kind of circulates around the back of the neck and then just kind of drips onto the sides of the shoulders and the neck. So I thought that was an interesting little detail that again just kind of cemented the overall look of this bat suit even more as one of my favorites as far as the most recent ones that I've seen. You got a much more tech looking kind of bat symbol here on the front of the chest piece that, like I said, to me just stands out very nice with the matted textures, and that's ultimately one of the big emphasis of this figure is the textures. I love the matted look to the overall costume. The shoulder pads look beautiful, as well as also the very clean but also very well textured gauntlets and boots. They're a cleaner aesthetic. There's nothing too heavily involved with those portions of the suit as far as, you know, padding or extra kind of armor. In fact, you could argue that this probably exposes it more to dangers. But overall, I just like how much smoother the gauntlets and the boots really feel, because they actually did a pretty fascinating job with either the pieces that they used to kind of give this pseudo leathery kind of feel, or the paint jobs that they actually applied. My only gripe would be the actual spikes you have on the gauntlets here that are very charismatically Batman, because this time around they went with 2 instead of 3, which I don't mind. But the rubber that was actually utilized for some of these spikes is a little on the thin side, to the point where if you do press up against these pieces a little too forcibly, then you come at the risk of kind of warping them in a particular direction, so do be careful with them. But as we kind of navigate this figure, like I said, he's got a much more simplistic but beautifully textured look. You got the heavily padded and pocketed utility belt here in the middle that I really love the look of, and then you have the thigh armor pieces right here, very reminiscent of, I would argue, the Arkham Origins suit. So it's giving me an awful lot of Arkham vibes. You'll notice that I'm making an awful lot of comparisons to other properties, but they're taking from some of the best. And frankly, frankly, for the first time in a while, I'm really loving the cape they utilized this time around, because even though it's got that fixed design of it waving in one particular direction as if the wind is blowing it to his right, I really, really love the texture they used to kind of give this thicker rubber piece this kind of coated leather look. It has some weight to it, some heft, but on top of that, if you kind of graze your fingers amongst it, it legitimately feels like a rubber texturized cape. So I love the look of this cape in particular, and it really complements the overall suit that ultimately, to me, for a little while there, this figure was kind of becoming one of my favorites. Until we got to the articulation. Because sadly, having a very technologically advanced future state and aesthetically pleasing suit was gonna come at a cost, and that cost was the articulation. Now, we start off rather well with the head articulation that's able to not only rotate the 360, but also be able to tilt up and down generously and be able to kind of sway from side to side very smoothly and effectively. And of course, like I mentioned before, having the head sculpt be beautifully kind of etched out just makes this one of my favorite head sculpts, to be honest, as far as the complements between the head itself and the neck, the way that the neck is designed, and the way that the joint is overall constructed. I'm actually pleasantly surprised. Once we get to the shoulders, though, is where we get our first little issue, because even though it is able to rotate vertically 360 degrees, it's during the extension part of it all that then my first alarming kind of detail came into play, which is the armor pieces, because as beautiful as they look, they didn't do what they have done in the past with other McFarlanes, specifically the Arkham Knight Batman figure from McFarlane Toys, where they place the shoulder pieces and they kind of put the adhesive at the far end here towards the bicep swivel. This time they put the adhesive more so towards the middle, so the entire shoulder piece is glued onto the shoulder, as opposed to just having this end and having the, I guess you could say, the top half of the shoulder be a bit more flex and loose to allow movement to flex within this area here. Because the entire piece is gelled and kind of, I don't want to say bolted down, but glued down, as opposed to how it was in Arkham Knight, being able to flex the arm up is only goes up to that point right there before you start to see the shoulder piece, the rubberized shoulder piece, starting to crease in and of itself. And that's very disappointing. It not only is it ruining the look, but it's pretty much just making the articulation practically non-existent there when it comes to extension. That's really about it. That's as far as it goes on both arms, and I can tell this is not an isolated incident. This is just how everything is just kind of designed. Same thing goes for that butterfly joint inside. Now, the one on my left, at least for the left of the figure, is very well complemented. You could definitely see an awful lot of shrugging motion right there. So the butterfly joint does allow shrugging motion to be done very fluently, but in terms of being able to move the arms a lot more than what the extension could allow, it's practically the same thing. Not much is really going to go down there. And unfortunately, that continues on with the bicep swivel. It is able to turn left and right, but the 360 movement is completely cut off. So if you were like me, who were huge fans of joints that were able to rotate the full 360 degrees, you could pretty much forget about it, because this time Batman worked out his triceps a little too strongly, to the point where the tricep muscle is actually getting in the way of, once again, that shoulder piece that's completely adhesived down. I know that's not really a verb, but that's the best way that I can articulate it. But the tricep is getting in the way of that rubberized shoulder piece, and because of that, he's not able to rotate the full 360 with the biceps. It's still able to turn. You can definitely see that there's movement going on, but both the tricep and I would even argue the bicep is kind of getting in the way of that. And because of that, you can't really turn the arms vertically, or horizontally I should say, as much as you wish in that joint. So it's very, very limited. Thankfully, the elbows come through once again with the double joints being able to bend all the way upwards like so. So they stay to tradition, as well as the wrists. Now, because of the gauntlets, however, again, despite me loving the look and the design and the textures of the gauntlets themselves, not a whole lot in the way of vertical mobility upon that vertical cut inside of the wrist joint. You're able to fully rotate them 360 degrees like before, but that cut, being able to kind of bend them inwards and outwards, it's a little bit more limited. Then we get to our torso joint, where the disappointments continue, unfortunately, because as aesthetically pleasing as, again, the textures on this mid-torso area are, and also this cut right here, you would expect it to have quite an awful lot of crunching movement because of the way that this overall abdominal area is cut out. There's no crunching whatsoever. There really isn't, which is weird considering that, yes, it actually can rotate the full 360 degrees. And as I kind of noted with DC Rebirth Batman, you'll see how this part of the back is kind of protruding out. But on that figure, you were able to kind of press it in and smoothly kind of get it flush. So that joint was able to allow some more flexible movement. Can't be found here. Because I saw this kind of sticking and protruding out, and I thought to myself, oh, I could just press it in kind of like DC Rebirth Batman and get that flush, so that'll allow flexibility and being able to crunch from side to side on the obliques. Yeah, no, none of that found here. It doesn't press in, and because of that, it's only able to rotate 360 degrees on the mid-torso, but frankly, no crunching. I mean, there's a slight bit of movement right there, but it's mostly due in part with some slight movement on the waist. Vertically, but in terms of crunching side to side, there's virtually none. It's very stiff, and there's absolutely no waist articulation as far as horizontal movement like on DC Rebirth Batman. Like I said, that slight crunch, you see it going in and out, it's actually because of the waist, but it's only, like I said, it might be just a happy accident, the fact that it's actually able to do that to begin with. I don't know why it is that they made his torso so rigid, but that's ultimately the hand that we were dealt. When we move to the top of the legs, we get some more conflicting reports. Not necessarily for the better or worse, but more in the matter of preference. Because even though he's able to move the legs forwards about that much, which is pretty generous. It's not too bad, not too great, but not too bad either. And is able to move the legs only about that far before it conflicts with the crotch piece. The extension is a little weird because you'll notice that when I started off the review, he was pretty open-legged, and that's because when you flex the legs inwards like so, they're molded and affixed to the inside leg joints in a very weird stance that he becomes a little top-heavy with the complemented cape that I was mentioning earlier. As much as I like the look of the cape, it is frankly quite top-heavy, that there's no other way to really pose him except to extend these legs. So I thought to myself, okay, let me extend these legs outwards like so. He looks a little awkward in terms of how open his legs are. But I thought to myself, okay, at least leg extension could be found there. It's just strange that the ratchetedness found within the leg extension is flexible, but also very loud. You can hear it creaking very heavily, almost to a fault, where I'm like, okay, I like my ratcheted joints as much as the next guy, but that sounds like it's about to break. You know what I mean? Like, I just feel a little insecure flexing and extending the legs. They can go about that far before they start to come in the way of the utility belt. But the actual noise they're making, it's making me a little bit nervous. And as we navigate downwards, there's more issues with the joints that you would expect out of a McFarlane figure, because you do get the two joints here that allow the knee to bend. However, and I noticed this almost right off the bat, as I'm pressing them upwards to be able to bend, you'll notice, for the first time in a McFarlane, you're actually not able to bend the knee, all the way up. Almost every time that I've covered a McFarlane, the knee is able to bend the leg almost all the way up into itself. And I know, anatomically, it's a little weird, especially for someone that's armored up as Batman, but this time, it stopped right about right there, and I'm like, what the hell? What's the issue? And I realized that the issue is not so much that they didn't articulate the knee enough, but they didn't cut out, and I'll try to cut to a close-up here to really show what I mean. They didn't cut the actual area where the joints actually move behind the leg here, behind the knee, behind the thigh rather. You'll notice that the actual cutout where the joint is this joint piece on the middle is supposed to move, it's not cut out as high up as other McFarlanes have done so in the past, and because of that, it stops. So when I bend both knees upwards, that middle piece that pretty much makes up the kneecap stops right about right there, and that's why it's not able. So the bottom leg is pretty much able to bend up to where it generally does, but this time around for this particular Batman, they didn't cut out the piece here behind the leg as much as they traditionally do high up with other McFarlane figures. And I don't know whose choice was it to throw that into the blueprints for the figure when it was being manufactured, but a big oof, rather, in my opinion, because that's rather a step backwards for a traditional McFarlane, especially one that you were hyped up for as far as appearances are concerned. And then when we move down to our ankles, we have that traditional joint that is able to move the knee horizontally 360 degrees and pivot upwards and downwards. However, again, factoring in the motif that we got going on here with the articulation, which is style over function, you'll notice that I'm having some trouble not only moving it horizontally, but also pivoting it up and down because of the way that this boot is designed. The rubber piece comes into conflict and pretty much kind of forces the ankle joint to be in one particular position. So when I try to move the ankles about and the feet about, you'll notice I have a little bit of resistance being felt there as I'm trying to move the feet in any kind of direction because of the way that this rubber just kind of encroaches the entire thing around. And this is one of those instances, similar to the rest of the figure, where the style I was just so infatuated with that it didn't come into consideration how that was going to affect the articulation. And unfortunately, this is also one of those victims for these particular joints. But hey, toesies are still found there. They're a little bit on the thinner side, but they can still bend on both feet right there. So ultimately, it's becoming a bit of one of those be careful what you wish for kind of scenarios where the look of this figure was just so cool to me that ultimately I found myself kind of heartbroken by how terrible the articulation really is, because I was just coming into an issue one after the other, and you kind of saw another one right there where posability is going to be a little flustered due to not only some of the joints not being able to bend the way that I want them to, or because of the way that the legs are kind of designed in that straightforward pattern that ultimately I have to resort to this really open-legged kind of static pose because A, some things are just not done, or B, that cape is just way too top heavy that it's not able to work with the articulation in tandem. And because of that, I have to put them in this way. Now, frankly, there is some levity found in the accessories. Par for the course, you have Batman coming with a gold-plated batarang right here. Pretty simple and straightforward, so it kind of complements the look of his figure. However, you'll notice that both of his hands are open and they're kind of sculpted out to look like he can hold the batarang in both hands, which is particularly true. You really can pose him with the batarang in each of his hands. And the batarang is actually molded out in a way that one of the grooves here at the bottom of the wings is sculpted out in a way where it can kind of rest on his other three fingers, and in between the three fingers and his index finger, that he holds it actually really, really well. So you can see right there, the batarang is actually a really nice fit for either of his left or right hand. However, if you want him to look just a little bit more intimidating, McFarlane did in fact throw in two fisted hands that you're able to swap out both hands. So if you want to have one hand holding the batarang while the other one is clenched up in a fist, you can then swap them out. What I found even more pleasant, and thankfully, like I said, something that was able to soften the blow of the disappointing articulation, is that swapping out the hands is actually kind of convenient. It sports a similar joint that you've seen before on the wrists here with the little peg at the end. However, there's something about the way that the hands are molded. I can't put my finger on it, but there's something about them that makes it a much more intuitive experience, which comes a lot for me after covering the finger gun, pointy, pew-pew Red Hood figure from Gotham Knights, which had one of the most frustrating swappable hands, not only because of the choice of giving him finger guns to begin with, but also those joints are a humongous pain in the ass that every single time I dreaded putting in the hands or swapping the hands in and out because those joints were just so frustrating. Thankfully, that's not the case here with next Batman from DC Future State, because those joints are actually molded in a very flexible sort of way that it allows the hand swapping to be a bit of a breeze. So you can hear from my tone of voice how ultimately disappointed I was in the DC Future State next Batman, because he genuinely looked badass. I really loved the look of this figure. I liked some of the little details that they were able to put into it as much as possible, especially from the textures used on the actual armor to the really weighty and capable cape and the actual look of the head sculpt. It's just a bummer that the articulation is holding the figure so far back that, frankly, I feel like if you're a completionist of the McFarlane Toys Batmans, yes, definitely pick them up. If you're a fan of the look of this figure, I recommend them still, but just with the huge ass asterisk at the end of this statement. And that asterisk pretty much encompasses all of the articulation here. If you're able to kind of put up with the articulation here, or if you know for a fact you're either going to keep him in box or in a very static pose, then have at it, because I would say he'll complement your collection. But if you're not a fan of not being able to pose figures as much as you would have them because of the way that they kind of overlooked some hindrances that didn't exactly match the articulation and have it complement with the look of the figure, then I would definitely understand if you were kind of remiss to want to pass on this one. However, if you are a completionist, or if you just like the look of the figure and you want to add them to your collection, be sure to use the affiliate links in the description below to help out the channel quite a bit. In the meantime, check out this other McFarlane toy review, subscribe for more reviews coming out in the future, and as always, stay humble. I'll see you in the next one.